Welcome everyone. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute here at King's College London, and it is a real pleasure to welcome you in the room and many more online to this Ronald F. Inglehart Honorary lecture. Christian will introduce himself in a bit and give a bit more context on the lecture. But I just want to say how particularly delighted we are to host this here at King's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, that we run the UK leg of the World Values Survey from here at King's. And we did that first back in 2022. And we're delighted that we've just won the new grant to run this study again next year in 2026. And what's particularly pleasing about this is that our first study, the one that we did in 2022, we had to kind of apply for that grant funding through an open call, as ESRC call it. So it's just, you just put in proposals and they pick the best of those proposals across all sorts of different subjects. But for the 2026 study, the one that we've got coming up, ESRC have moved it to their infrastructure investments, which is, you know, again, lots of technical things just for people in the kind of academic world. But what it really means is that ESRC, UKRI, our funding bodies in the UK, have got a higher level of commitment to running WVS, World Value Survey, into the future. And it puts on the same sort of level as big studies like the British Election Study, Understanding Society, all of those really key parts of UK data infrastructure. And obviously I wholly agree with that as a signal, not just for our funding, but for as a signal for how important it is to track values, beliefs, attitudes, how they're shifting, and then crucially, not just how they're shifting here in the UK, but how that compares to the world and how the world is moving. So that is the value, the deep value of these types of studies, particularly at this point in our history. And second reason for us, it's just an honor to be doing this event in Ron Inglehart's name, who of course is such a key figure in the World Value Survey, and then much more generally understanding shifts in values across the world. Just a visionary on that, and a lot of Ron's work inspired me and us here to focus on understanding exactly how those values are shifting and how the UK fits in. There's really vital information that informs lots of decision making in policy and practice in real life, in the real world. So I'm going to hand over to Christian to introduce himself and then our honorary lecturer. But just to give an idea, very quick idea of the overall format, we'll get to questions from you in the room and online about 1:45, that sort of time. So we'll have time for questions at the end. And for those online, do use the Q&A function and do upvote the questions that you would like to be asked. I will come to those. It makes my job so much easier if I just pick the top ones. So do get onto that. But for now, hand over to Christian. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you very much, Bobby. And congratulations on being now part of the infrastructure of the ESRC, which is very good news. At the same level, like the British Election Study is really like some sort of Nobel Prize. And we are very happy that you, as principal investigator of the World Value Survey in the whole of the UK, and King's College are our national partner for the UK. We have 100 partners around the world, and you are definitely the first in the group. And within our group meetings, we always say, these King's College reports about the World Survey are the best all over the world because they really get to the point regarding results and research. So, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, and friends of the World Value Survey, it is my distinct honor to welcome you to the Ronald Inglehart Honorary Lecture, held today at King's College London. Whether you're joining us in person, here in London, or online from all around the world, thank you for being here as we gather to celebrate the legacy of one of the most influential scholars of our time and a modern-day titan of social and political sciences. Ron Inglehart was not only the founding president of the World Value Survey Association, he was also a visionary whose research reshaped our understanding of how values evolved and how they shape societies, institutions, and democracy. His lifelong work on modernization, post-materialism and materialism and cultural change remains central to the mission of our association and to the global conversation on human development and governance. This lecture series was established to honor Professor Inglehart's profound contributions to political science and sociology, as well as social sciences in general. And in order to continue the intellectual inquiry, he so passionately championed. Each year, we invite leading voices and world-class scholars to explore the complex relationship between values and social transformation, and never more relevant today as ever. But Ron was more than a brilliant scholar. He was also a generous colleague, a mentor, and a friend to many of us here and across the world. In the next few minutes, we would like to share a short video, a collection of memories and moments from Ron colleagues all around the world. These photographs and messages capture not just the intellectual legacy, but also the deep personal impact he had on so many lives. I had the honor and pleasure to learn from Ron and to work with him since the 90s. He has kindly invited me to serve as principal investigator of Hungary and Moldova, and I had the big honor as a young postdoc with dark hair to organize the meeting of the Executive Committee of the World Health Survey at the famous Hotel Sacher in Vienna, when the EC decided about the final questionnaire for wave 3. Bobby is in charge in Britain for wave 7 and now wave 8. So wave 3, we met in Vienna to discuss the questionnaire in the 90s. Ron gave me always a kind, collegial, and patient advice. When I started as PI for the WVS, and I still remember the frequent fax messages, which don't exist anymore. Young people here don't, what is a fax? And which I received from Michigan in my office at the Paul Alzheimer Society of Social Research in Vienna. Maybe we can play now this video. Thank you very much. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Marita Inglehart from the University of Michigan to share her greetings on behalf of Ron's family. Professor Marita Inglehart and her family have very generously donated the award of today and other awards of the World Health Survey to honor the continuing legacy of Ronald F. Inglehart. Marita, the floor is yours.
Good morning. I'm very excited to be here and just love to see these photos. One would be thrilled to be here and listen to this lecture and see this wonderful history of his life. First, I want to thank, in the name of the whole family, Ron's 5 children, 9 grandchildren, the World Value Survey Association President, Christian Herpfner, and the Executive Director of the World Association for Public Opinion Research and head of the Secretariat of the World Value Survey Association, Ksenia Kiselova. I also want to thank Dr. Duffy, the host of today's event, and above all, I want to congratulate Dr. Mattes for being selected and thank him for accepting to present this lecture. But then I want to quickly return to December 1978 when Ron and I took a long walk along the River Rhine in Mannheim, Germany. I asked him, what would be the dream of your professional life? And he clearly responded and elaborated extensively to have data from all over the world and be able to understand what they tell us. That was 1978. And over the years, it was wonderful to see his dream come true. And it is wonderful to see it continue even now that he is no longer with us. Having these data is tremendously important in these current times. And I hope it will help to not only describe what is going on, but that it will help to understand the dynamics unfolding these days and work on what can be done to make this world a better place than what it is right now. The last sentence in Ron's book, Religion's Sudden Decline, What is Causing It and What Comes Next was, and the search for meaning goes on. That was his lifelong kind of supporting sentiment. And may this lecture today and the work of all researchers using the World Value Survey data contribute to bringing meaning to the current times and the future. And thank you for giving me a few minutes to share this with you.
Thank you very much, Marita, for your kind words and for your support of the World Health Survey in so many endeavors. The World Health Survey Association is now delighted to award this year's Ron Inglehart Honorary Lecture Award to Professor Robert Mattes. Professor Mattes is a globally recognized scholar whose outstanding work has profoundly shaped our understanding of democratic attitudes, political behavior, and governance, particularly in the context of Africa. As a co-founder of the Alpha Barometer and a leading voice in comparative survey research, he has contributed in a significant way to building an evidence-based foundation of understanding how citizens perceive democracies, trust institutions, and engage with political systems. His work is aligned with the mission of the World Health Survey to promote a deeper data-driven insight into the values and beliefs that shape human societies. Professor Mattes has combined methodological rigor with an unwavering commitment to understanding democratic culture in its many diverse forms. Today's lectures, which we will deliver shortly, exemplifies the spirit of this award, a forward-looking contribution to our ongoing conversation about the challenges and future of democracy in the 21st century. It is therefore a great and distinguished honor, both personally and on behalf of the World Health Survey Association, to present Professor Robert Mattes from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow where I received an MSc degree in politics many moons ago with teachers like Richard Rose, Ian McAllister, Mark Franklin, and William Miller, and where I served as visiting professor at the Center for the Study of Public Policy, CSPP, for many years. I would like to present Professor Mattes with the Ronald F. Inglehart Honorary Lecture Award. Congratulations, Robert, and I give you the prize now. Congratulations.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I hope it's a good decoration in your office and we show your importance and significance.
It will take pride in place in my new, we're just moving offices now, so this will take, will be a nice addition.
Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to thank Marita for her words and say thank you to the society for this honor. It's indeed an honor and a privilege to receive an honor in the name of Ron Inglehart. I first met Ron in about 1995. I just started working for a policy democracy advocacy organization in Cape Town, South Africa, and we were starting to do public opinion surveys funded by the now dearly departed USAID on South Africans' attitudes about democracy, but we also knew we wanted to get involved in supporting and continuing the work of World Value Survey, which the University of Stellenbosch had been maintaining previously. And so I made a kind of what it was, thinking back, a kind of a pilgrimage to Ann Arbor to meet Ron, and always was a inspiring moment in my career because he's truly a scholar and a gentleman, both committed to excellence, but also a real, probably the best way to describe it as a real mensch, a really nice, honest person, and a warm human person. So it's indeed gratifying then all these years later to be giving this address. When Chris got a hold of me and asked me about giving a talk, I realized I'm not currently doing anything really with World Value Survey data. And most of my work is focused in Africa, but I thought, a talk like this should be really cross-continental. And the one thing I have been working on, and it's very much a work in progress, so I hope you receive that in that light. And these talks are meant to ways to get feedback on what I think is a really important, fundamentally important subject that we haven't quite nailed yet, and finish it up. So again, that's the light of, take that into consideration when you hear what we have to say. But so it's a project I've been working on with my colleague Richard Gunther at Ohio State University, and Richard is the director of the Comparative National Election Survey, yet another important instrument of comparative survey research, but focused on doing post-election surveys at various places around the world. And so the subject for today is anti-democratic parties and what we call autocratic voters. Thinking back to when we first took that job and started to think about why we were doing public opinion surveys in South Africa right after its first democratic transition, why I went to meet Ron Inglehart, etc., was just this assumption that democracy, regardless of its levels of wealth, its type of political institutions, its type of electoral system, requires a cultural basis. The democracy requires Democrats. And that's a founding assumption of this entire literature. It dates right back to the work of Ullman and Verba, the civic culture. If you want to put it, maybe the most recent major work in this literature, the same assumption is Yascha Mounk's book on People versus Democracy, and everything in between. But that's sort of like the alpha and omega of a literature that you want to look at the bookends, and also the data collection. And again, people like USAID, various other donors have been very fundamental in making sure the World Value Survey, the new Democracies Barometer that Chris helped start with Richard Rose, the various barometers, etc., have all been based in one way or the other on the assumption that democracy requires Democrats, small d. If you're in the United States, you always have to say small d so you don't get accused of partisanship. And that somehow there's a connection there, that democracy requires people to work. It just won't work as a set of institutions by itself. Now, about 4 years ago, I was asked by Oxford Research Encyclopedia to review the literature on support for democracy. And what was really striking is, given already we were 4 decades into that literature, there's really little evidence of this. There were a few studies by Jim Gibson had just come out of the field in the Soviet Union with a set of surveys and got back to Kennedy Airport and picks up a newspaper, and Gorbachev has been overthrown temporarily with a coup. When the coup was done, he was able to get money from the National Science Foundation, go another soon to be departed institution, goes back in the field and is able to do a panel study of the same people before the coup and after the coup in the regions around Moscow, and was able to first person to really draw a link between attitudes expressed before the coup and what people then reported doing in support or opposition to that. Other than that, there's two other studies that I highlighted by Richard Gunther with CNEP data, and by Key and Doshal Shin, looking at attitudes about what he calls dissatisfied democracies and movements in democracy in new democracies around the world. But other than that, just not a lot of solid evidence. One of the reasons why is because if any of you have tried to work with this data, you know that there's various projects who run at various timetables and various clocks in various countries, and they have various assumptions and ways of framing questions about democracy. And so different countries have different years of data. We have democracy data for every country, but we only have public opinion data for some years. Sometimes it's from the World Value Survey, sometimes it's from a barometer survey, some places. And I'm proud to say one of my students, former students from the University of Cape Town, who went on to bigger and better things doing his PhD under Jim Gibson, Chris Clausen, has really now written the seminal piece where he took all that data and said, look, we can actually realize that there's underlying trends that's going under these things. And regardless of whether you measure it maybe with World Value Survey, which measures support for democracy a little bit higher, the barometers, which is a bit lower, there's underlying trends that you can create a latent variable and create missing value, fill in the data for every country for every year, and was able then to show that there was indeed a systematic relationship across, what was it, 135 countries over 29 years, that support was positively related to both the level and the endurance of democracy. So I consider this really incredibly important in our discipline and for the work we're doing. But that raises the question, though, why? What's the mechanism? How do these values or these attitudes translate into things that citizens do or don't do, which makes democracy more or less stable? One possibility is just the climate of opinion. A potential coup planner in Burkina Faso may, like a groundhog in Pennsylvania, stick their head out the hole every once in a while and say, is it safe? Will I get support if there's a coup? Or should maybe we just lay low because the society is more or less democratic? Or if we want to remove term limits, the presidential advisors want to remove term limits, what's it like? Are the legislators going to get blowback from the citizens? So what? Just the climate of opinion is one way. Do citizens, are democratic citizens more likely to go out and vote, to participate between elections? That's another way Democrats, small ds, can give life to democracy by participating in it. Or is it that it's at crucial times where Democrats have to come out and protest? I mean, thinking of the massive crowds that turned out in Israel a few years back when the government was trying to limit the powers of the courts in Israel. That would be an example of that kind of key strategic levels of protest. And lastly, and the subject of today's talk is, do Democrats, when they're faced with an explicitly anti-democratic party, translate their values into choices? So on top of everything we know about what makes voters vote the way they do, is it possible that in situations like this, that also democratic values help inform people's vote choice in a way that might then make sure that democratic parties win elections and non-democratic parties don't? So in this area, we're not the first ones to look at it. There's a huge literature around populism, populist parties and populist voters. But populism, at least in principle, is consistent with understandings of majoritarian democracy. Right? So this is the argument of Jan Erik Muller. Where it departs is it's critical of the ideas of countervailing institutions. It's critical of the ideas of social pluralism. And governments that are populist tend to portray themselves as the sole authentic voice of the people, but it's not necessarily inconsistent with democracy. So our concern is with a specific type of party that we call an anti-democratic party, which is analytics separate from populism, It's very closer to what Giovanni Sartori once called anti-system parties. And these are parties that we think see over the last 10 to 15 years started to see, as we moved further into the fourth wave of democracy, started to see political value in attacking democracy, that there's votes to be won. Or they feel at least they can reveal their true hostility, and they can come out of the closet, as you will, and reveal their indifference or hostility to democracy, because criticizing liberal democracy is no longer in their society beyond the pale. Now, how do we identify global anti-democratic parties in a way that's not just our subjective judgments? Well, fortunately, Pippa Norris and her colleagues put together something called the Global Party Survey. Several years ago, I think there's more recent rounds as well, but at least the one we use is 2020. I developed expert codes for over 1,000 political parties across 162 countries on a variety of characteristics. But one of which is they develop a scale of populism, but includes 2 items, which they ask, again, usually around, I think, a dozen experts in each country are asked to judge for each party in their country whether the party strongly undermines or strongly respects liberal democratic principles, norms, and practices, and the degree in which the party strongly favors or strongly opposes checks and balances on executive power. So we fairly arbitrarily define an anti-democratic party as a party that gets a score of 7 on one or both of those indicators and an average score of 6.7. And what we find is that anti-democratic parties differ from, I use the word merely, I don't mean really, simply populist parties. So if you look at the scale of populism that the project uses, which contains those 2 items, the correlation between the 2 things is only around 0.3, and that's really astonishing, given that that populism index contains 2 of the items. If you stripped it out, it would be probably the 2 things would possibly more even orthogonal. So that's just a cross-tabulation to show that across the top is the Global Party Survey scale of pluralism, and then whether the parties are anti-democratic. But what it shows is that only about 1/3 of the parties on the right of the scale who are moderately or strongly populist qualify as anti-democratic. Basically the finding is almost all anti-democratic parties are populist, but not all populist parties. Only about 1/3 of populist parties are anti-democratic. So we see that this is, why one should isolate this and study these parties separately. Indeed, some of the most prominent parties in the country covered by our analysis, so M5S in Italy, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, don't qualify, according to this data, according to these experts, as anti-democratic. Now, what are the possible connections between anti-democratic attitudes and anti-democratic parties? One is, and we separate these into a queuing effect, a potential queuing effect and a potential persuasion effect. The queuing effect is where the anti-democratic party in a campaign or in its rhetoric leading up to the campaign kind of acts as they send out cues by what we say. Donald Trump makes noises about shutting down certain democratic practices, or Marie Le Pen makes similar noises, and voters who previously maybe not have supported you say, "Oh, they're singing my song," and they move toward that party, and so this is a process of consolidating what we've, just so I don't use the same label for both things, autocratic voters, authoritarian voters, and they're kind of brought into a single home. So it's not increasing the level or decreasing the level of popular support for democracy so much as just consolidating the non-democrats behind a single political party, which makes that party probably a more potent and dangerous force. So that's one mechanism, a queuing mechanism. The other is a persuasion effect, where potentially anti-democratic parties can persuade their followers who were following them for other reasons, but over time they persuade them to change their opinions to less democratic and more anti-democratic opinions over time. So this then would bring down levels of support for democracy in the country, and then it creates greater space for anti-democratic entrepreneurs to press their demands if they're in opposition, or limit democratic spaces if they're in government. So the queuing effect. We use data from the Comparative National Elections Project, which is a series of cross-national post-election surveys done in countries across the world. We look at surveys since 2013 at the countries that, according to global party surveys, have a anti-democratic party. And so our dependent variable is whether or not the respondent reports voting for that party. And then we construct a standard model of vote choice to explain that. And this is just it's a bit hard to read, but the scale is a question you might have seen. I think it's been in the World Values Survey, maybe in early rounds, about whether democracy is always preferable, whether it's at times an authoritarian regime can be preferable or it doesn't matter. And then survey questions first started by Richard Rose about whether opposing undemocratic alternatives, asking people whether they would support or oppose ending elections and letting the president make all the decisions, bringing the army into rule, or just having one political party. So the scale runs from 0 to 4, which is just how many pro-democratic statements do you endorse? Or later on, we'll talk about the autocratic voters, or these are people who fail to endorse several of these statements. So what we do is take a standard model that of variables that are available in all these post-election surveys about evaluations of the economy, trust in the government, ideological left-right self-placement, religiosity, whether or not you belong to a trade union, your self-reported income and employment, a series of standard demographics. And to that, we add then demand for democracy. And so does that accurately predict whether or not somebody tells us they voted for Le Pen or I'm just, my mind's going, but Morena in Mexico as examples of anti-democratic parties in those surveys. Now, there's two potential problems here. One is attitudes to democracy may be expected to both shape views toward the leader of those parties, as well as toward the party itself. So I'll show you in a second, we do a three-step model. First of all, we use these variables to predict support for the leader, say for Donald Trump, Marie Le Pen, the head of the ADF. Second model just predicts support for the party by itself, voting for the party. And the third predicts voting for the party holding constant for your evaluations of the party leader. The other problem, of course, this is cross-sectional data, is two-way causality. Right? This is not panel data, and it's entirely possible that the values the reports we're getting are shaped by the party they belong to rather than vice versa. So we make our best attempt to try and control for this in two ways. First of all, we examine only those elections in which the anti-democratic party is standing for the first time. So the likelihood is reduced that there's been any kind of socialization effect before that. And then secondly, where we have elections where the anti-democratic party is standing for a second or third time, what we do is the CNEP has a really nice question which asks people how they voted in the previous election. So if you report voting for ADF in the previous election, we exclude you. And we only look at new supporters. It's not perfect, but that's our best attempt to try and rule out reverse causality. This is just a list of the parties that qualify. In Kenya, it's Jubilee. In Turkey, it's the Erdogan's party. In Greece, it's Golden Dawn and the Communists. Taiwan, Kuomintang qualifies. United Russia and Putin. The Republicans in the United States qualify according to the scale as an anti-democratic party. Alternative for Deutschland. So just to give you a Vox in Spain, a flavor of the kind of parties we're talking about and the kind of election studies we're talking about. I don't really expect anybody to look at this in detail, but it's just again to make the point. In the first column is predicting support. The rating of the anti-democratic leader. Do values about democracy make you more or less likely to give a good score to Erdogan, for example? Secondly, is do values about democracy make you more or less likely to vote for the anti-democratic party, but not taking into account views of the leader? And thirdly, does it still predict vote choice even after we take into control, just to see whether it's support for the great man leader or the party itself? Very quickly, just to show where the countries that we have where you had a party running for the first time. The left-hand column is how the impact of democratic values, that scale I showed you, on the rating of the anti-democratic leader. The second is the effect on voting for the anti-democratic party. And thirdly is the effect on the party controlling for the leader. So in Greece, for example, people who are not democratic or who are people who are democratic are far less likely to give us a positive rating to the head of Golden Dawn, far less likely to vote for that party, almost about 9 times less likely. and even controlling for their views about the leader, they're still substantially less likely to vote for the party. We see the same thing in the United Kingdom. So we had a 2018 survey in which we had UKIP in, and they qualify as anti-democratic. Nigel Farage, no effect, but maybe he wasn't the leader at that time. I can't remember. But clearly, British citizens who are less democratic or more democratic were far less likely to vote for UKIP. We see the same effects in Spain, Kenya, very strong effects in France for the AFD in Germany, and at least toward the who would have been Zelensky's opponent in the 2019 election, although no effect in the first in Mexico when Moreno first won power there. This is the results where we have parties are running a second or third time. So this is just on new support, far lower ends. And mostly here, with the exception of the United States, which it doesn't affect ratings of Trump, but it does American Democrats, small d, are less likely to vote for the Republicans, and even controlling for Trump, significantly less likely to vote for the Republicans. But for the rest, with the views of the leader make more of an important impact, which makes sense for voting theory. Tells us if people already identify with a party, the thing that's going to most be important in changing that standing vote choice, to use Bioki's term, are things like campaign issues and the candidates. So it makes sense that here Democratic attitudes are probably most likely to support to predict the views of the leader, but is not as consistent as with first time elections. Now, turning it around, can anti-democratic parties persuade their partisans to shift their prior regime preferences away from democracy? And again, this is cross-national data. We don't have panel data to test two-way support. So what we do is construct a different line of causality, and we're not just taking the same variables and sort of jumbling them up again. What we're doing is going to take standard equation models that I've used over the years, and many of my colleagues have used to predict support for democracy, stemming out of the work that Chris and Richard Rose and Bill Mishler did, the work that I've done with Mike Bratton, which is looking at people's perceived level of democracy, their satisfaction with democracy, the freeness and fairness of the election, levels of education, interest, internal efficacy, and demographics. So we strip out all those performance-related things that were in the other model, just so we minimize the cross pollution. And then we add in whether or not you voted for the anti-democratic party and ask whether there is at least corroborative evidence that affects your support for democracy. And these are the same studies that we just, but again, turning it around, and you have strong support for the other way around as well, right? So that in Taiwan, on that 0 to 4 scale, if you voted for Kuomintang, you're about a full point lower on your support for democracy. So clearly, there's a lot of two-way mutual causality going on here. People have some ideas about how some way to try and filter this out. We're thinking it might maybe go into some directed acyclic modeling, but I'd be really happy for any ideas that people have. And then trying to move away from election surveys, we moved to the Global Barometer survey. And this was a round of surveys that the Global Barometers did in 2017, 16, 17, in which they asked the same set of questions across Africa, East Asia, South Asia, and Latin America. Again, these are all face-to-face interviews with nationally representative samples. And we see the same model and the same results down the right-hand column. A strong impact in about half of the countries, but not in the other half. But some really strong impacts in places like Nicaragua. If you report voting for the Sandinistas, you're a full one in the third point less likely to support democracy than anybody else in Nicaragua. Venezuela, strong impacts. Colombia, Zimbabwe, people who support Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF, and so on. So we've got corroborative evidence of both things. I think theoretically that's probably what's going on, right? And we would like to be able to be more precise in estimating the mutual influences, but I don't have any strong hypotheses. We don't have any strong that it's just one or the other. But ultimately, what makes this, why we're concerned about this in the first place, is how this is shaping macro level trends. So what we do here is, as a way of maybe getting at the direction of flow of causality here, is we conduct a kind of a cohort analysis. I mean, most cohort analyses have very stable populations. This is not necessarily true here, but we take the people who we classify as autocrats, meaning people who score 0, 1, and 2 on that 0 to 4 scale. And we look amongst them over time and to see whether the overall proportion of those people remains stable, but whether is there movement amongst them toward the anti-democratic party, or whether there's that group is both growing, possibly at the behest of the anti-democratic party. So what do we mean by this? So let's just imagine a world with all that space under the curve. It's actually a flat line, not really a curve, but are the non-democratic citizens, the autocrats. But on the far left, I should have, the font is too small. Time 1, say 15% of them support the anti-democratic party. But at time 2, survey 2, that's a poor choice of colors, 20%. And time 3, a much larger group of people. But the overall level in society hasn't changed. It's just people are migrating, are consolidating. So that's what we think about the queuing effect. The persuasion effect would be that, say the, sorry, and just to make the point that these other colors, apologize for that. These are the people who support other parties, and these are the people who don't vote. Now, in this scenario, the non-Democrats supporting other parties or not voting remains stable, but the percent supporting the anti-democratic party grows. So we can infer there's some persuasion going on. They're converting more people. And lastly, there's probably places where both are going on. The anti-democratic party is consolidating people behind it and growing the numbers. So I want to finish up with just 4 examples of different types of patterns that are by no means conclusive, but just illustrative of the type of things we find. Persuasion. This is Taiwan. We had a Taiwan survey in the CNEP in 2004. So at that point, very few Taiwanese qualify as autocrats, and about 5% of them supported Kuomintang, 8% the rest of the parties, and 10% didn't vote. This is after Kuomintang had 2 terms in office when they returned to power. Kuomintang was Chiang Kai-shek's the one-party government under the authoritarian period of time. They lost power. There was a Democratic Party governed Taiwan, but Kuomintang came back in 2008 and 2012. And through that period, now we have a lot more Taiwanese who are anti-democrats, and a lot more of them are behind the Kuomintang party. So I think this is a good suggestion of a period where there's persuasion going on. But fortunately, when we go to the 2020 situation, once the Democratic parties came back to power, the situation reversed itself. So we'll come back to this idea that this is not plain sailing when an anti-democratic party comes to power. There's all sorts of pushback, of counterpunching, and so it's not just a one-way trip to pessimism here. What about queuing? This is Mexico, and there's lots of non-Democrats in Mexico, autocratic citizens. It's about 40% in our survey in 2006. And then in 2012, they grow a bit. And then along comes Morena under Lopez Obrador, classified as a non-democratic Trumpist type of party. All of a sudden, they now claim a big scoop of the anti-democratic voters, and they increase it in 2024 under Christina Sheinbaum. So I think this is an example of queuing that's going on. And what about both? This is Zimbabwe. If you call Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF was the Liberation Party leader, but they had gotten increasing competition from the Movement for Democratic Change. And in 2008, they in fact lost an election. Were able to win it on a second round election, and also lots of violence. And after that, ZANU-PF recommitted itself to taking that autocracy cleavage and using it to their value, and really talking about it on a very active basis, to both grow the number of Zimbabweans who are not committed to democracy, and also claim larger shares of them over time. So that takes us up to 2017. But it also shows once Robert Mugabe leaves the scene, he dies and leaves the scene, even a well-resourced, extensive political party, ZANU-PF, has a hard time. So there's a kind of a regression, but they're still fairly much in control of the anti-democrats. A very different profile is when I call it undefeated, people who, anti-democratic parties who ruled under authoritarianism, and they kept winning elections once a country moved to democracy. Tanzania is like that in Africa. But Mozambique, I mean, look at the share of first of all, there's lots of Mozambicans who are not Democrats, and they almost all herd behind Frelimo. And that proportion has been pretty stable over time. This probably, if we had overtime data in Nicaragua, probably would be the same type of thing. So you see that same profile on different continents of parties that use violence, have histories of revolutionary rhetoric, that's critical of liberal democracy, and they're able to consolidate those supporters. And lastly, maybe most controversial, there's at least, we have a couple countries with no apparent effects where we expected to find them, but this is the United States. So we have three surveys in which we have the full scale, 2016, 2020, and then a recent survey, which was after the midterm survey that our colleagues at Ohio State were able to get funded, 2022. What you see is that the share of non-Democrats or autocratic voters in the US has come down very slightly, but the share of them voting Republican has remained absolutely the same. So this raises some really interesting points of debate between a whole literature that's really pointing to dramatic, heavily pessimistic about changing attitudes in the Republican and Trump's ability to change Americans' attitudes. This suggests possibly not so much. Okay, we have corroborated evidence of both types of effects. Right? The voters look around non-Democrats, or Democratic parties systematically avoid voting for non-Democratic parties and vice versa. But also the suggestion of evidence that parties can also over time socialize their supporters. But at the aggregate level, it appears to be more evidence in general, and there's a lot of things I didn't show you for lack of time. There's more evidence, I think, of anti-democratic parties' ability to consolidate their support amongst autocratic citizens. So they don't increase it so much, but once they get into power, they're able to consolidate them, and that makes them a more potent force to the detriment of democracy. More support behind them to take anti-democratic actions and to narrow democratic spaces. Also, we see some examples, and there's more again in the rest of the data, that once anti-democratic parties lose power, or especially if there's term limits that are respected and the leader leaves, their grip on their grip on the anti-democratic voters, autocratic voters, reduces. Former liberation parties seem to be better positioned. Again, I would look at Tanzania, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, but also Nicaragua as examples of this. And lastly, again, some widely cited places. In Germany, we have the same effect. We don't see AfD consolidating any greater support behind it in terms of this non-Democrats. The US, so there's some cited cases which parties don't seem to be able to do this in the first place. And with that, I'll thank you for listening and welcome criticisms, comments, but any suggestions that you might have. And again, thank you. It's been to the Society. It's been, again, an honor and privilege to give this talk in Ron's name. Thanks very much.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob. And just for the people online, I think you had a bit of background noise from the microphone. That is entirely down to our slightly Argos kind of cut price microphone that we have here. Nothing to do with Bob. So apologies for that, but I think you could hear it from what we could tell from others, which is the main thing. So we have got time for Q&A with Bob, and then we do have refreshments at the back of the room where you can stay on for afterwards for more casual conversation. But any questions? It was fascinating, Bob. So this is going to be a kind of come up to the microphone type session, and then Bob, you're going to have to come back here too. Yeah.
Thank you. Sure. I'm Peter Knowles. I'm a lobby journalist. I work for C-SPAN in Washington. Two questions, if I may. One is, could you explain the thinking behind classifying UKIP, and I presume you'd do the same with Reform Now, as an anti-democratic party? populist, I get. I'm wondering how you get to that classification. And the other is, I wonder if there's anything that can be said about what the impacts of the cuts to USAID might be for the survey. Thank you.
Great questions. Let's see if there's any more. Yes, please. Are you okay to come up? That's okay.
Max Dubois. I work in propaganda for charities, if you like. A question looking at the consolidation of the base. What does an anti-democratic party have to deliver in order to maintain that? I'm thinking of Russia, where you've seen falling living standards, but a heady mixture of propaganda seems to keep them in power rather than having them turn against them. Thank you.
It would be great to just take one from online as well, please, Bob. I might actually throw two at you, if that's okay. You can. This is from Lucy Bush. I realize your data is pre-reform. It kind of follows on from that question. But what can you say about whether you think, or the measures think, they are an anti-democratic party or just a populist party? So focusing that question more on reform. Sorry? No, but I think it just directly links to this, because obviously it reform, yeah. So in the UK, we're obviously obsessed by reform, yeah. And then second question, is there something to be said here for the purposeful reframing or the 1984ing that anti-democratic parties are doing to make themselves out to be ultra-democratic and the savior of democracy and the people? Very good question. It's an anonymous question, but very good one. Very good one. Please, Bob.
Very good questions, because they don't have answers. In terms of the UKIP, I would just blame the Epipenorisis experts who filled in the survey on this is what British policy party experts have said in terms of it gets quite high. I think it's like it gets a score over 8 in terms of the experts. Look, it is a limitation of expert judgments surveys, right? That we're asking experts to kind of canvass their mind about a whole range of things and give a score based on whether they think certain parties do certain things. Okay, so that's I don't claim any more expertise to say anything more about reform. Yeah. I mean, you could check the rhetoric and their stances on things like judicial independence or legislative oversight or freedom of speech, etc. And hopefully those would corroborate each other. But I don't have any more expertise to try and pretend to answer those questions. So the question about USAID, was it on democracy or on the surveys about democracy? Oh, quite. I mean, luckily, I can speak to our case in Afrobarometer. During the first term, we both had some surprise reversals from the Canadians when the Harper administration came into power, and we were very worried about reversal in the first Trump term. And luckily, we went on a strong, guided by lots of organizational specialists, to reframe ourselves so we could get a lot more support from foundations and weren't as dependent on bilateral donors. And indeed, that was a very good move, because we dropped a substantial bit of money that was in the pipeline, was contracted for. We're just not going to get it. But luckily, it's not having the kind of impact on us now that it would have 5 years ago. But I think there's probably a whole range of other surveys that get the support of aid. There is also the State Department does a lot of its own internal surveying of people's opinions about democracy and about the United States. It gets very much tied up with the notion of measuring soft power. This administration, I think, doesn't think there is something called soft power. It doesn't seem like, right? So I would fear that those surveys, and one of my former students works as a public opinion specialist in the State Department. I have a lot of worries about what's going to happen to them, just because it's a cheap cheap way to get rid of money on a subject you don't really understand or agree with. And also the cuts for British aid will also have the same kind of effect. Although I think British aid tends to be project by project and proposals rather than specific support to any major platform. But luckily, other organizations seem to be now stepping in, coming to us and again, I assume they're doing it to other foundations, to other projects, saying, "Can we help? Can we step in where you may have lost money from that?" So but it is a real situation. What do anti-democratic parties have to deliver? I mean, it's a question we're trying to attack much more in the next round of the Afrobarometer. So we're devoting a lot of time now to thinking about a new module of questions, both getting at the World Values Survey and the Barometer surveys. What a colleague once said, the World Values Survey is like measuring climate change of public opinion, where the barometers are about measuring weather shifts. It's more about governance and politics and not deep value shifts. But we're going to try and pull some of those values to understand maybe what are the values that might make Gabonese and people in Burkina Faso tolerate a military coup when they've been living under civilian rule for so many years. But one of the things that does go along with the anti-democratic attitudes and support for, so if I'd had the full model up, we would have seen it, but it just wasn't enough space to process all that information. People who classify them, with one or two exceptions, people who classify themselves on the right are much more likely to vote for an anti-democratic party. Strong distrust in the incumbent government, and also economic dissatisfaction. So if you turn that around, it's probably, again, this assumption that somehow less democratic parties can reimpose order and also economic success is my best, my best stab at answering that question. Anti-democratic parties acting as saviors of democracy. Again, it depends on what I believe. Often populist parties can pose that, because again, they are not necessarily opposed to rule by the people, but it's this kind of unmediated rule between the voters and a strongman executive with little checks and balances or pluralism. So just by doing so, they can often make that claim quite legitimately. It's a difficult question to ask, because you'd have to go kind of country by country, but I know it is in the case that a colleague of mine, Eric Nisbet, who also worked with CNEP, he presented something at Wayport last week, and he makes the point that of those people who cited democracy as a reason for the vote in the most recent American election, the majority of those people said it was the Democrats who were going to threaten democracy. And again, some areas of woke politics can be demonstrated to be, suppressions of free speech, or at least could be argued, right? So it's not a completely fanciful argument to be made. But again, I think the answer to that is really differs case by case.
Great. We've got time for one more round if people would like. Yep, Roberto.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. Thanks so much for this presentation. Hi, yeah, very good. How are you? Okay, good. Really fascinating stuff, really exciting. And I really was really interested in the findings you have about autocratic or authoritarian consolidation. And I want to push you a bit on that, because I think that to me is something that's counterintuitive and exciting, because I think what a lot of people would say, and the view I come across often, is this idea that for populist parties, at least, their supporters, they represent viewpoints, policy attitudes, positions that are not reflected in the current political offer. And that's why at time zero, their supporters, are skeptical about democracy and support that party. But nonetheless, the idea is that, okay, once those parties get momentum, once they influence policy, once they enter government, some of their supporters might change their view, right? They might feel, okay, now democracy is working, now democracy is functional. But what you're showing, at least for anti-democratic parties, is that that's not true.
Or is it temporary?
Or it's temporary, and that's what I want to ask about. And so I'm wondering whether or not, what do you think of the idea that maybe sort of populist and anti-democratic parties, right? I mean, this is almost kind of like a duck rabbit, right? It's that you don't actually know until a party gets into office if it's populist at least, is it also anti-democratic? You're only going to discover once it actually really starts to do anti-democratic things, once it has the power and leverage to do so. So what I'm wondering is whether or not, like, what we're observing there is kind of like those parties that, for whatever reason, once they're in office, decide to take a more overtly anti-democratic tack, right? That is that the factor that kind of consolidates their supporters there and saying, yeah, we don't support democracy at all?
Really great question. I've got two more here that are quite related, actually, from people online, and maybe we call it there because the people in the room, you're staying around for a bit, Bob, so you can pick up with Bob. So I'll just both of these relate to themes that have already come up, but good to just get these across too. So is there a possibility that the lack of relationship in the United States and Germany can partially be attributed to citizens who would typically be classified as autocrats, but don't define themselves as such? In these countries, the anti-democratic parties present themselves as more democratic than the other. So it kind of links an earlier theme, but also I think to Roberto's theme a little bit of the duck rabbit. Yeah, exactly. And then final question, Carol Hayden, if anti-democratic parties are more likely to consolidate rather than convert, what would be an appropriate response from the Labour Party to reform UK? You can tell we've got quite a focus on reform in the UK right now. The consolidation point, which again sort of links to Roberto's.
Thanks for those, because obviously, yeah, you kind of draw these early conclusions. I'm not sure whether they resonate, but clearly this one resonated. It tells me there's something to it. The Taiwan example is where at least again, although in the field all the time, surveys are often missed cycles, but the decline in autocratic feeling in Taiwan occurred after Kuomintang left office, which is, you might have predicted the opposite, but we didn't have enough between surveys to know anyways. But that comes after, then you have at least a whole term of the DDP back in power. I was trying to think of some of the other examples. But quite often, I think it more correlates with, we have something like that in Nigeria, where the All People's Convention becomes a serious contender. Again, they're rated as anti-democratic by the experts. They start consolidating the positions, and once the two-term link kicks in, and I think it's Abdullah leaves office, then there's a less charismatic figure, and they start losing that. So I think in Africa, you at least this and many other occasions, there is evidence that two-term limits really do work, because parties often aren't strong enough to sustain that and just get a new leader and keep on ruling in an authoritarian fight. It really is dependent a lot on the great man, or France, the great woman being there. So I think term limits are incredibly important issue that you might have short-term temporary deviations, but it tends to force parties back to kind of regression on the mean, maybe. Yeah, I'm trying to think about. There was a lot in those questions. I don't know if I've done them justice. Bobby, is there something I haven't touched on?
No, I think that's right. People are taking the consolidation.
Yeah.
Designs over time, saying this is not used.
And right now, this is not very statistical. It's just gut readings of moving pictures, right? But it helps us give an idea of what's, because often we have some contradictions. The micro level regression analysis, for example, tells us there's no effect of Marina in Mexico in 2018, but the visual picture says maybe that's not why they voted, but it turns out that that's the support level they created. Whereas in AFD, we're finding strong micro level effects, right? but the number of Germans who are anti-democratic is relatively small, and the AfD hasn't enlarged this. And I looked at data just yesterday when my colleagues left me. We got a hot off the press survey from the most recent 2025 election. No real increase. So there's still, again, they haven't done this consolidation. Right? So other people are supporting them for other reasons, but also the non-Democrats go toward it, but other people might support it for other frustrations and dissatisfaction with the existing alternatives.
Well, that is quite a hopeful note to end on, which is great. So I think we are all done on the session. Just left for me to say thank you very much to the Policy Institute team for putting this together. Of course, to Christian for hosting and introducing. Bob, of course, congratulations again, and thank you for a really fascinating lecture. And then, of course, great thanks to Marita and, of course, in Ron in setting all of this up. Thank you all for coming. Do stay around for drinks at the back. Thank you all.